In the last few videos, we've looked at understanding and practicing some of the fundamental animation skills that we will face as we try to produce more complex animations. And we've gone through these in some very simple examples on some very simple setups. In this video, we're going to wrap all of that up somewhat, finish off working on those sorts of things before, in the following videos, moving on to actually starting to tackle more general animation. And so for this, we're going to take some of the mechanics that we've been playing with and put them into just doing a simple animation with some very simple body mechanics going on. What we're also going to do with that is start to work on slightly different systems. And by that I mean slightly different rig setups. Of course, as was pointed out in the All About Rigs video way back near the beginning, we're not trying here to learn how to, just operate the controls of one specific fixed type of rig. As such, the rig that we have in this character has a few different systems set up in different ways. So I do recommend using this specific character from the content to perform this exercise at least once, as what this allows you to do is to really start playing with different rig systems, different types of controls, and seeing the subtle differences that exist between the way that you'll lay out the specifics of your keyframes. So what we're going to do here is nothing particularly complex or special. We're just going to have this guy standing on the spot, and we're just going to sort of have him doing a little wavy motion, employing both the main trunk of his body, his head, neck, and his arms. And we're going to work these together, following through one another, overlapping one another, and working back and forth across one another, just to produce a nice, simple, slick little, wobble and wave cycle. First thing I'm going to do is, in my graph editor, make sure that the options have got my default curve set to linear, because that's what I'll start my keys in. So we'll be doing this sort of as a straight ahead. And I'm also going to set my auto key here to modified only. That way I won't be keying extra channels that I don't need to move, just in case I need to offset and overlap channels against one another. So we'll do this and start this out by taking it a piece at a time, as this will help us to more easily see, of course, what we want to do with the next part and the next part and the next part, because of course what we are animating here is a hierarchy. So I'm going to start just with his main root then, and we'll just sort of have him slinked off to one side over here. I'll come out 12 frames, let's say, and I'll put him at basically the mirror pose, so I'll just put him at the exact opposite value there on the x-axis. Sorry, I said 12 frames, didn't I? In which case it should be frame 13, not 12, since I'm starting on 1. I'll just put in a little 2 cycle as well, so I'll key this again, in this case 1 second later, so you can think of that as 13 plus 24, if you like, frame 37. And this, of course, I'll copy this thing, so of course that would be frame 25, 1 plus 24. And so you've just got this tick, tock, tick cycle going on like that. And I need to put one more tock, so it's a full cycle. So that would be what, 37 plus 12, right? There we go. That brings us to frame 49, so I'll just set my timeline there. Okay, so here's what we've got. He's just slinking side to side there, all nice and simply. That's very pretty. Now what do I want to do with him? Well, rather than start to work on other bits of the body, the first thing I'm going to do is spline this. So here we've got our X channel and the side-to-side movement, so I'm just going to take all of those and pop them over to TCB spline and just give them all tension 1. So this motion now is much like our initial pendulum motion. He's just, slinking off there side to side to side. Perhaps I want him to go a little bit slower. I think I've done this a little too fast. So I'll grab those frames there and let's just start shifting them. I'm going to go, I think, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Shift that along. And of course the next lot, 1, 2, 3, 4. Just so as each of these timings is 1, 2, 3, 4 further apart than previously. Let's see how that looks. Okay, playing that back, that's nice. It's, not too fast, not too slow. It's just nice and steady. So that's what we'll stick with then for this. So, is there anything else I want to do with this? And I think, sure, what I'm going to do is, of course, as he comes across here, I'm not going to keep him on the level. I'm sort of going to have him lift up slightly, essentially keeping his legs at a constant level of press, as it were. So at the halfway point, which is 8 frames, considering we're now on a 16 frame cycle, then I'll just raise him up a little bit on his y-axis like that. And so we get a little lift over and a dip down. Once again, I'm going to want to see that copied. This time I'll just do it in Graph Editor. I see that I've got some keyframes already on the Y channel there that came when I was, rekeying the root in those positions off of existing keyframes. So I'll just select those two there since I've already got a down, up, down. And what I can do is just find out where the next spacing is. It's there. So I'm going to hold Control, right mouse button, and copy to here. Come over to where the next down will be. Control, right mouse button, drag it out. There it is. And to the final one, once again, copy, drag, and there it goes. So that gives me my up-down motion on the y-axis there. Once again, we'll TCB spline that, set it all to 1, and there we go. We've got this nice little bobbing action over from side to side like this. Nice, clean, smooth little sort of movement there. What should we work on next then? Well, I think we should have some swing in his hips. He is pushing side to side like this, and of course, two-legged characters, well, any number of legged characters, as they move themselves across where their legs are, they will sort of lean around to distribute their weight from one leg to the next, to move their weight from one leg to the next. Now we could, of course, just put those rotations here on the root item, have him actioning in whatever way is appropriate. That would be fine. However, if we take a look here, we can see that we have this other little control, which is the hips root controller there, and this gives us an independent swing of the hips like this. And of course, when rotating that, you can notice that unlike rotating the main root, the upper body itself is not swinging. That means that we wouldn't need to counter animate the upper body, although such counter animation can also work for you. But still, one of the possibilities that you have on a rig sometimes is these separated out controls. That's what we have here, so that's the method that we'll employ. So here's how we'll play it. When he's in the extreme to one side, we'll tilt the hips the opposite way. That lifts up the leg that he's most over, putting his weight and press onto that one leg. So let's have that there. And of course, let's have the opposite at the opposite side of the swing like this. And then as you can see, we just repeat that out again for the cycle. So there's that little action. What I'm going to do though is to put a little bit of overlap and anticipation into how he swings his hip. So even though he reaches the full extreme, as he goes into the full extreme there, what I'm also going to do is have him hit that extreme earlier on. So his hip rotation will fast out of its extreme and sort of slow in to the next extreme. So what was the value we were reaching? Negative 8.2, right? So at the halfway mark, it would ordinarily be 0. Over to here, it's now at positive 8.2. So what I'm going to do is at the halfway mark, I'm going to key it at 6. So this way, he starts to pivot his hip back. Now, there's a reason for this, of course. Look at what he's doing. As he goes from one side to the other, he is actually pressing with this leg. Think about where the force is coming from. His hip isn't floating as if by magic. He's using the muscles in his leg to push his hip across to the side. Consequently, by beginning to tilt the hip earlier, like this, we wind up putting more press onto this leg, the leg of the side that he is leaving. Of course, we talk about, things such as anticipation. We talk about things such as, the forces that get applied. In body mechanics, one of the things, of course, that happens is that a limb, a spine, whatever, has to start applying a force before it moves. If you go to lift a weight off the ground, your muscles start pulling and heaving a moment before the weight actually starts to shift. So what we're doing here is using the muscles in his legs, the muscles in his trunk, to start propelling him over to the other side. And so of course we'll just, repeat this action, obviously tick-tocking it between, the positive and negative values as is appropriate for which way he is swinging. And what we see we get out of this is you can see how he's starting now to actually work his legs in pushing himself side to side like that. You can really see it going on in the knees. If we sort of look around him a little bit, you can see how his knees are doing this little bob as they grab and push his weight. So we'll take that controller as well. It was the bank channel that we were looking at. So of course we can see this different shape on our curve here. We've got this sort of hold region that occurs at each side. This fast out, slow in, fast out, slow in. So let's take all of those guys. We'll TCB spline them. And what we'll do is we'll tighten them up a bit. Not completely, because we don't want these things to sort of wobble flat like that. So I'm going to tighten them up something like this, I think, about 0.5, 0.6-ish. But actually these leading in keys, so that would be this one, that one, and of course let's not forget that guy over there. I'm going to have those slightly less tight so we get a smoother rollover through that point there. And there we go, we see that we get this nice smooth little side to side dance out of him like this. Lovely. Next then we'll move on to working on the animation of his upper body, or his torso at least. And for that we have this system here for the spine, which is a funny little sort of hybrid IK system. You can grab the goal and that just leans the spine completely square like this, and you can also rotate the goal and that will put bend and flex into the spine. And thus you animate the whole spine as a combination of these two actions. So what we want is this sort of little wave through the body, and we can sort of do this two ways. We can either have his spine trailing behind his hip, so of course as he's moving sideways like this, he, leans over in that fashion there. So you've got this overlap, if you will, this sort of follow through as the spine is getting pulled from side to side. Alternatively, we could do it the other way and consequently get this motion where he leads with his spine. He throws the spine first, sort of in an anticipatory way, which then leads the hips across. Doing it this way is what some of us would call the Carlton dance. For those of you not familiar, I'll just let you Google it. But that's the one that I think I'm going to choose here, because it's got a nice little sort of cartoony weave to it. So what I'm going to do is, pretty much at his extreme, at least for the minute, I'm going to push him off the other way and curl his spine over that way like this. We'll obviously flip, invert and repeat it like this, but what I'm also going to do is, much like we did with the swing of the hips, is add a little extra push in there. So again, we're going to have this sort of timed off change of direction. And what I'm going to do here is make it sort of a slow in, fast out. So this change in direction will be quite snappy. So I'm going to have this, let's say, 6 frames before the other extreme. So I'll take that and I'll copy that, in this case here, to frame 11. So he's there, and then he flips, and then the same here. This will go to frame 27. This one will copy to frame 43. You get the idea. So we're keeping this same time and space difference across these here. So of course what you see is pushing, and now he weaves back, and he weaves back, and just like that. Again, we'll come into his graphs. We'll find the necessary motion channels that we've got, which is basically his X and heading channels here. We'll grab those, we'll TCB spline them, and we'll set them again to around 0.5 tension to give them a little bit of follow through and overlap with one another. And this is, of course, what we get out of it. This nice little sway where he sort of tips his body first, and that leads his hip off in the direction that it is going. Now, at this point, we can look at the timing of that. I'm not sure how, swift that is. Maybe it wants to be a little slower. And what I'm going to think to myself is actually which way I want to swing it. And what I want to do, I think, is to introduce a little bit of overlap. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take the extreme point here. I'm shifting that out by 1-2 frames. That means he starts to weave just a little bit after the extreme. And again, we adjust that for the other extreme points. 1-2, 1-2. Of course, we need to adjust this last one, even though it just sort of winds up weaving off our timeline a bit there. And so there we go, we've got this nice little overlapped action of him just sort of, having a little dance. He's bobbing and weaving and, there you go. The best thing to do at this point then is to continue down the line of the spine and work into the head and neck. Again, we've got a different system here. We've got this spline set up for the neck there, whilst the head is just this simple FK control item. So let's think about what we want it to do. Well, I mean, we're leading here with the, the upper body, with the shoulders, if you like. They, go over first, and then the body and hip obviously follows. So we could, again, just counteract the head and neck to this, so as it weaves in the opposite direction. But for this, I'm going to actually have them lead as well. So what we need to have is the head and neck leading what's happening in the body, which leads what happens in the hips. So to get my timing right, because this is going to be a bit of an offset sort of motion, I'm going to come out to somewhere in the midst of this and think about what I want to be happening. What I want is for the head obviously to be, over to the side in which he's about to travel. But then as he arrives at his side and, starts to slow down, I want the head and neck to turn back the other way. So here's what I'm going to do just for the minute. I'm going to grab the head and neck. I'm just going to key them, straight out there at 9. Then I'm going to say here at 15, at this point, I will have the head and neck, coming across like this, starting to, bend out and weave back the other way. So I can see the motion that gives me there. See how he just sort of weaves off first with the head. And of course, as we get to this point and the body tips as well, it's becoming far too far. Notice the point, of course, at which I've set that. It's the point at which the body is pretty much upright. I'm going to add another little offset sort of motion to it, or overlap motion to it. And what I'm actually going to do here at frame 9 is I'm going to have the neck bending in that direction there. So it is pushed over like that. But I'm going to have the head already starting to sort of straighten by this point there, we see. So that way his head really sort of dips and weaves over just ahead of the neck. So let's get this to the other side so that we can, get a comparable in between. Of course, what we see is that this key at 15 there is 2 before the hip hits its extreme. So let's go out to the hip's other extreme and 2 before it. We can, of course, key the head and neck. That's, of course, in this same position that we have them back at 15. But we can go in and, of course, just invert the values that we have set there on that. And so we get the, opposite for that side. That's good. We can see how that you can see how that plays out by itself without actually the need for, or at least without an absolute need for an in-between in the style that we have there on 9. See, his head is beginning to roll ahead, and that's quite pleasing. So what we can easily do is just copy and paste the frames over here, of course, for the next part of his cycle, just like this. We just do that separately, of course, for all 3 of the items, the 2 neck ones that we've keyed and the head. And what we see is we get this, cute little back and forth weave like that. Very attractive. We can then possibly just get rid of this keyframe at 9. Why, even though we'd used it? Well, I mean, look at what we get now at 9. The head is almost upright there anyway, as it happens. And of course, what we're going to want to have is an earlier keyframe in his cycle there. Of course, we've still got this 16 frame spacing, but that's frame 15, so frame 1 here. What we would actually require would be a copy of what's at frame 30, so I can just grab the head and neck controls as they sit there, create a key, but we'll create it at key 1 in that position. Or sorry, from frame 32 should I say, not frame 31. And there we see it. We have this, nice little bibbly bobbly motion now going on right through his, hip, up the spine, head and neck, and you can really see how he's leading with the top of the head there. What of course is also interesting to take note of is how we've gone through keying this, or rather the specific pattern of the wave and weave that we've put into it, because of course when we've keyed the hierarchies before, as in the pendulum, the motion has always trickled down from the top of the hierarchy to the bottom of it. In this case, of course, the top of the hierarchy is here. It's the root item. The spine is a child of that. The neck is then a child of the spine. And the head, of course, is a child of the neck. But what we've done is we've led with the bottom of the hierarchy rather than the other way round. So whereas before we've had this very passive system in terms of the pendulum, in this guy we've got an active system. And so even though we've still got, overlap, follow through and all of that taking place, it's happening in reverse to what we've already seen. And yet still we have keyed it up in broadly the same way, starting at the root item, top of the hierarchy, working our way through it, but we've had to work the offset, the time offset and position or rotation offset slightly differently. What I might do is just accelerate this, head roll out a bit, so I'm going to come back to frame 9 just for the head and pop a little tweak on there, and also I think just on the middle neck joint a little tweak there, so we can see him really roll that pose out. That of course is 6 frames before the next extreme, so we basically want a copy of that over at frame 41, which is of course the cycle's next point when it hits this point, as well as of course an inverse of it at frame 25 and also frame 57. And then we can just go to those and of course reverse those values to be correct for that side of the cycle there. And there we go, our little guy toing and froing, weaving around, really leading with the head. Of course, let's spline these up. So we'll come to the X positions for the 2 spline controls that we've used there. And we can grab those and of course just TCB them. With this main one, which is the top one of course, I'm going to use a tension 0 there, but then not really so much on the other one. I'll keep that a little bit looser. Then of course we come out to his head controller, which we have a heading rotation for, and then with everything TCB'd we get this little weave going on right through body, head, neck, all very cute and smooth and toony. The last thing that I'm going to do with him then is put a little bit of a wavy motion on his arms. We could of course just work them to keep them, more or less by his sides like this, so as he sort of keeps his arms roughly, just floating about like this. But what I'm going to do is put sort of a dancey weave type motion on them for a bit of extra fun and some additional life as well. And the way that I'm going to structure this is to try and observe a bit of balance in his body. One thing that you have to do when you're animating a character with a body is to imbue it with some balance as well. As we talked about, back in fundamentals and so on, when you've got characters in play, they need to be able to balance their bodies roughly. To an extent, that's what we've got going on already with the, spine, hips and head. The head is leaning over, putting weight down on this side, but the hip is pressing that way, putting weight over on this side. Overall, his body is reasonably well balanced. But we'll accentuate that even further with the arms. Here's what I'm going to do. At his extreme to the side here, where his body is on one side, I'm going to bring the arm on that side up, and I'm going to twist it as well to bring the elbow up some around there. And I'm going to put his wrist around and sort of tilt that up as well. something a bit like this. It probably helps to look at it in something of a front view. Bring it out to the side slightly like this, or sorry, bring it forward slightly like this, I should say. Just tip it up a little bit more there. I'm just going to right his wrist around a little bit there, put a bit more of an angle on that. Okay. Then for the opposing side, I'll have his arm still out some, but much more down, pretty much in the pose that we already see it in here. Come out to the, equal extreme in the cycle, which would be here, and then to the same for, the last point of the cycle over here. Then for the opposing sides, obviously, we'll just key and invert all of that. And rather than doing it exactly, I'll just sort of do it manually, so as I get a little bit of, random variation, as it were, to his movement here. So it's not so perfectly symmetrical on each arm, on each side. No particular reason for that, it's just sort of, a bit of added fun, if you will. And then once I've done it on the one frame, obviously I'll just rekey that over to the other to copy that pose. So that, of course, will go to 49 here. So there we go. We can see the basic of what he's doing there. I've messed up that hand by the looks of things. That should be up. Let's just pop that up. There we go. 49 as well. Let's just play it back again. And there we can see he's doing the whole little wiggle and wave like that, looking quite nice. Okay, what I want to do is create some offset motion in here. First of all, I want to create something of a quicker movement in the middle of each arm's swing. I want there to be a nice slow out at the end of each swing, so at the extremes, but in the middle I want it to happen just a little bit faster. Obviously, a TCB spline will give me that, but what I want to do is just overswing it a bit. So to do that, I'll just select all of his arm controllers, and what I'll do is I'll come out, let's say, 3 frames from one extreme pose and 3 frames from the other extreme pose like this, and I'll just shift each of them a further 2 frames along like that. So we get this slower action coming out of the extreme with this swift little movement in the middle, and then a slower at the other extreme there. And of course we can just repeat this along the timeline here. And so once we've got those in place, we now see that we've got this really nice sort of, linky swing that he's putting there in his arms. Now what I do as well, now that I've got these frames in place, is to create a little bit of overlapping action. So what I'll do is at this point where he's coming up, I'm going to let the arm turn down a bit more. So this overlaps the action on the bank channel against what's going on in the heading and pitch channels. And then I'll just ramp it up a little bit at the next one there. Okay, and then I'll sort of do the opposite on the downstroke, keep it ramped up at this point and really under ramp it at that point, and just sort of, do the same thing here throughout the timeline. So if we watch that one arm now, you can see how he's, turning and rolling that over with a greater bit of speed. And there, just work exactly the same thing on the opposing arm, like that. All very nice. We'll look next at the elbows, and we'll do something again, similar there. What we'll do in this case is as the arm starts to come down, we'll actually pitch the elbow right up like this, so it starts to break down that way. And it can come right out there. And again, it slows up, and as it comes out of the up, we break it up like this so it really snaps out. Let it flop down, come up into the up, and of course the same on the opposing side here. As it starts on the down after the extreme, we flick it up in those 2 places there, and there we see that gives that extra little bit of flop in the arm action like that. And then lastly we'll work on the wrists, and so as the arm is coming up in its upstroke there, we'll really flop that wrist down like this. We'll keep it flopped at this point, right before, you know, his final up, which is there, and then on the down, we'll sort of sell it backwards. So it's going this way. And as you can see, that gives us this snap action on his wrist like that. Then before the absolute down extreme, we'll also keep it just sort of tilted up a bit like this as well. So it comes down and snaps back down. Go just overselling it as we go to put that little bit of, you know, follow through in. Again, very much like the pendulum here, we're acting on the arms. And what we can do even here at the extreme down is give it a real bit of flop if we like, just to give it a little extra sell there. And then if we see that taking place, we now see this real flippy floppy action starting to work in on that wrist. Of course, we go through the other side and just, you know, double all of that up there to make it behave the same. Turning it around here, keeping it nice and flexed, breaking that joint along the way, so of course it flops about quite soft, and so there we get the wrists overlapping with the whole action there. Again, we've done this on the same set of keyframes. Our overlap is built into our keys rather than having keys overlapped in time. In this instance, of course. Of course, it then just remains for us to come in and, you know, do the whole TCB lark on all of the curves for these items. For the most part, we can generally leave these at 0 because, of course, there's an awful lot of, you know, ability for little whips and follow-throughs. But I'm going to just take a look to make sure that any double humps that we have, like this here, get just worked out. So we can tease those off slightly. And any overshoots that are too strong here, we can tease those out. And if you want to just put an added bit of, you know, snap into some of these motions, then you can find, you know, in between keys like that, between a high and a low, and you can swing those negative as well to really accentuate the whip of that curvature. Again, we have little double humps here on the bank of the shoulders, which is as we should have. Got double humps at each extreme, we just tease them off so they're not so strong. And once we've just teased those curves a little bit, we get a really nice, you know, flappy, sloppy sort of, you know, wiggle and weave there into his motion. So there we go, I'll just concentrate the timeline on one cycle in the middle there so as we can just see a single clean repeating cycle for his little dance there. And there we have it, a basic bit of body mechanic animation where we've got, you know, different actions going on with a bunch of different control systems in play. We've got, you know, obviously his root and hip system. We've got these standard sort of FK pendulums on the arms, this sort of hybrid IK spine, a spliny neck, and just a plain old FK head. So a nice little piece of practice in, again, applying, you know, the basic techniques that we've seen in the past few videos, and of course, you know, a bit of play with some of the different control systems that you might encounter on, you know, any particular type of rig along the way during your adventures in animation.